of The Tonight Show. Rick Nelson is here, along with Franklin Avalon and Kurt Thomas. It's a real pleasure for me to meet you because I spent a lot of my time watching you on your show and so forth, and I'm very, very impressed with you being here. Thank you so much for that.
They were two young men who defined an entire generation, Frankie Avalon and Ricky Nelson, golden boys of a new America where rock and roll was shaking the ground and teenagers ruled the airwaves. Frankie, the handsome kid from Philadelphia who sang his way into the hearts of millions with Venus and Why. And Ricky, the boy next door who grew up before our eyes on the adventures of Ozzie and Harriet, while secretly becoming one of the first true teen idols. Together, they represented innocence, charm, and the new sound that parents feared but kids adored. Yet behind the dazzling smiles, there were private struggles, quiet rivalries, and unspoken truths. Now, at 84 years old, Frankie Avalon finally pulls back the curtain on a friendship shaped by fame, shadowed by pressure, and cut short by tragedy. For the first time, he opens up about Ricky Nelson, the boy he once knew, the man he admired, and the painful secrets that only time could reveal. Before he was a legend, Frankie Avalon was just a boy from South Philadelphia, born Francis Thomas Avalon in 1940, raised in a working-class Italian-American household where dreams were often smaller than the city streets that shaped them. But Frankie's dream was different. He had a horn in his hands by the time he was 12, a gifted trumpet player who seemed destined for jazz clubs and orchestras. By his mid-teens, however, destiny had other plans. The smooth-faced, dark-haired boy with the wide smile wasn't just talented, he was marketable. At a time when the music industry was hungry for clean-cut idols who could appeal to teenagers while still earning a nod from worried parents, Frankie Avalon became the perfect candidate. His voice was soft, melodic, easy to fall in love with. And when Venus hit number 1 in 1959, Avalon became more than just a singer. He became a phenomenon. Suddenly, television shows, magazine covers, and movie studios couldn't get enough of him. Girls screamed when he appeared, mothers trusted him, and fathers sighed with relief that this teen idol looked safe compared to the dangerous edge of Elvis Presley or Jerry Lee Lewis. Yet Frankie knew that the image of perfection came with a price. He was young, but he was learning fast that fame wasn't just about talent. It was about branding, appearances, and being everything people expected him to be, even when he was exhausted or unsure of himself. The pressure was relentless, but Avalon embraced it. He understood that opportunities like his didn't last forever. By the early 1960s, he found himself starring in a series of light-hearted beach films alongside Annette Funicello, becoming a symbol of American youth, surfing, sunshine, and carefree fun. The movies weren't critically acclaimed, but they were adored by audiences, and Avalon's fame grew even larger. Frankie was not just a pop star, he was a crossover success, one of the rare idols who could sing, act, and charm his way into every corner of the entertainment business. Yet while the world saw him as a boyish heartthrob who could do no wrong, Frankie knew the reality was far more complicated. Stardom was isolating, and though he was loved by millions, it was hard to know who truly loved him. The crowds cheered, the cameras flashed, and the checks rolled in. But behind closed doors, Frankie Avalon was still just a young man trying to figure out who he was outside of the posters on a teenage girl's bedroom wall. And while his career skyrocketed, another young star was rising in parallel, one whose path would eventually intertwine with his own, Ricky Nelson. While Frankie Avalon was conquering the music charts and movie screens, another face was becoming just as familiar to America. A boy who seemed to grow up right in their living rooms. Eric Hilliard Nelson better known as Ricky Nelson, was born in 1940, the same year as Frankie, but his path to stardom began in a completely different way. Ricky was the son of Ozzie and Harriet Nelson, a beloved showbiz couple whose radio program transitioned to television as The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet. By the time Ricky was 8 years old, millions of Americans were tuning in weekly to watch him play himself, a wholesome, all-American boy being raised in a picture-perfect suburban family. But Ricky had more than just good looks and charm. He had music in his blood. In 1957, while still a teenager, Ricky stunned the world when he recorded A Teenager's Romance and I'm Walkin', songs that showcased his smooth voice and easy style. He wasn't just Ozzie and Harriet's son anymore. He was a star in his own right. Soon came the hits that defined his career: Poor Little Fool, Hello, Mary Lou, and Travelin' Man. Each one cemented his status as one of the era's top teen idols, a rival not just to Frankie Avalon, but even to Elvis Presley himself. Girls adored him, boys admired him, and parents trusted him. Ricky seemed to be everything America wanted in a new kind of pop idol. Yet behind the carefully managed image of the clean-cut boy next door, Ricky was quietly restless. He was grateful for the fame, but he bristled at the idea that people saw him only as the sweet-faced kid from his parents' sitcom. He wanted to be respected as a serious musician, not just a teenage heartthrob. Unlike Avalon, who leaned into Hollywood films and the business of image-making, Ricky began to search for authenticity in his music. Even at the height of his fame, Ricky was experimenting, mixing elements of country and rock, long before the term country rock became popular. Still, he couldn't escape the teen idol label that clung to him, even as he longed to break free. The irony of Ricky Nelson's fame was that while America thought it knew him better than anyone, after all, he had grown up on their screens, very few actually understood the man behind the smile. Frankie Avalon would later reflect that Ricky was one of the loneliest stars he'd ever known, a boy who had everything and yet felt that something essential was always missing. For Avalon, their parallel journeys would soon become a bond, one forged not only by fame, but by the struggles of living under the crushing weight of expectation. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, the world of entertainment was both vast and yet incredibly small. Every teen idol, every chart topper, every television star seemed destined to cross paths, and in that whirlwind, Frankie Avalon and Ricky Nelson inevitably found each other. Both were born the same year. Both became stars before they were even old enough to truly grasp what fame meant, and both were navigating an industry that demanded perfection while offering little guidance for how to survive its pressures. Their first meetings were brief: industry events, music award ceremonies, television guest appearances. But there was an immediate recognition between them. They weren't competitors in the way the press often painted them. They were fellow survivors in a world that could be both intoxicating and cruel. Frankie later recalled how Ricky had a quiet, almost shy demeanor off stage, a stark contrast to the confident performer the audience saw. While Frankie leaned into charm and showmanship, Ricky was more reserved, thoughtful, and introspective. But behind closed doors, when the screaming fans faded and the lights went down, the two young men could relax in each other's company in a way that was nearly impossible with anyone else. They would talk about the surreal reality of being adored by millions, yet feeling isolated at the same time. Frankie often joked that Ricky had it harder. After all, Frankie could step away from the spotlight occasionally, but Ricky had literally grown up inside of it. Every move he made, every girl he dated, every song he sang was scrutinized not only by fans, but by the millions who had watched him since childhood. They bonded over those pressures, and they found themselves trading advice about careers and music. Frankie remembered Ricky confiding in him about his frustrations at being seen as just the kid from Ozzie and Harriet. Frankie, in turn, admitted the exhaustion of being pigeonholed as the perfect boy next door, never allowed to show flaws or weaknesses. Both longed for authenticity, but were trapped in images created by studios and fan magazines. Away from the cameras, their friendship wasn't built on wild parties or reckless stunts, but on something much quieter: understanding. There were nights on tour buses where they sat up late talking about dreams of artistic freedom, or moments backstage where they shared the burden of living double lives, icons on the surface, but regular young men underneath, yearning for something real. For Frankie, looking back at '84, those moments stand out more than the fame, more than the awards or the adoration. He remembers Ricky as someone who didn't just understand the highs of being idolized, but also the crushing lows that came with it. In the glare of the spotlight, they were teen idols. In private, they were just two young men trying to find themselves in a world that didn't always let them breathe. For all the glamour, screaming fans, and endless headlines, the truth of life as a teen idol was far less glamorous than it appeared. Frankie Avalon and Ricky Nelson lived in a world where every smile had to be perfect, every move calculated, every word rehearsed. It wasn't enough to sing well or act convincingly. You had to embody the fantasy the public demanded, even if it meant losing pieces of yourself along the way. Frankie, reflecting now at '84, admits that the pressure was relentless. He remembers long days of photo shoots where he was asked to smile until his cheeks hurt, interviews where the same questions about romance and teenage love were asked over and over, and stage performances where fainting fans were treated as part of the show rather than a reminder of how surreal their lives had become. For Ricky, the weight was even heavier. Unlike Frankie, who had some choice in how his career unfolded, Ricky had been a product of the spotlight since he was a child. By the time he was a teenager, audiences believed they knew him personally. He wasn't just Ricky Nelson, the singer. He was Ricky Nelson, the boy who grew up in their living rooms, who belonged to them in some strange way. That sense of ownership from the public created a prison Ricky often couldn't escape. Behind the fame lay exhaustion. Both young men were constantly on tour, recording endlessly, and being pushed to keep producing hits. If one song slipped from the charts, the pressure to deliver another was immediate. Record labels treated them less like artists and more like commodities, shiny products to be sold to eager teenagers. Frankie remembers Ricky confiding his frustration. "I can't breathe without someone turning it into a headline." Frankie himself knew that feeling well, the isolation of being surrounded by adoration but starved of authenticity. There was also the struggle of transition. Being a teen idol was profitable, but it was also fleeting. As the fans aged, as tastes changed, the clock ticked faster and faster on their careers. Frankie found refuge by shifting into films, starring in beach comedies that gave him longevity and allowed him to reinvent his image. Ricky, however, sought reinvention through music itself, chasing authenticity over popularity. But in the moment, neither could escape the crushing demands. They had to look perfect, act perfect, and sing perfect, or risk losing everything. Frankie recalls lying awake at night, staring at hotel ceilings after concerts, wondering if he was truly happy. Ricky, too, confided in late-night conversations that sometimes the applause felt hollow, as if the crowd wasn't cheering for him, but for the image projected onto him. To the outside world, they had it all: fame, fortune, fans. But behind the curtain, the pressures of stardom were suffocating. Frankie now admits that it was a miracle either of them survived as long as they did, carrying the weight of expectation that would have broken lesser men. As the 1960s unfolded, the world of music began to change. Rock and roll, once the rebellious sound of youth, was evolving into something deeper, more experimental, more rooted in authenticity. For Ricky Nelson, this shift was both a challenge and an opportunity. No longer satisfied with being a polished teen idol who sang catchy pop songs for screaming girls, Ricky wanted to be recognized as a true musician. He had always admired country music, its honesty, its raw storytelling, and he began blending it with rock to create a sound that was ahead of its time. This was the birth of what we now call country rock, years before the Eagles or the Byrds would popularize it. Ricky's Stone Canyon Band became his vehicle for this transformation, and through it, he proved he wasn't just a television star turned singer. He was an artist, willing to take risks. Songs like Garden Party revealed his frustration with being trapped by his past image. At a famous Madison Square Garden performance, Ricky played his new material only to be met with boos from an audience that wanted the old hits. Out of that moment came the now iconic line, "You can't please everyone, so you got to please yourself." That single lyric was more than just a verse in a song. It was Ricky Nelson's personal declaration of independence. Frankie Avalon, reflecting now, recalls how Ricky poured his heart out to him in private during this period. He wanted to be respected not as the clean-cut boy America grew up with, but as a musician with depth, someone who had something meaningful to say. Frankie admired Ricky's courage. While Avalon chose to secure his career through Hollywood films and television appearances, Ricky was willing to risk commercial decline in order to chase authenticity. It was a bold move, but it came at a cost. Record sales dropped, critics often overlooked his innovation, and industry insiders dismissed him as a has-been who refused to stay in his lane. Yet those who truly listened recognized that Ricky was laying the groundwork for an entire genre. Frankie remembers conversations where Ricky would lament the way the public refused to let him grow, how he felt chained to the teenage image that had made him famous. But he never let go of his belief that music had to evolve, that he had to evolve with it. For Frankie, those talks revealed a side of Ricky the world rarely saw, a man who valued artistry over applause, who would rather be misunderstood than be fake. Today, Avalon believes Ricky Nelson never got the full credit he deserved for his pioneering role in shaping country rock. At 84, Frankie looks back with admiration, knowing Ricky's evolution wasn't just about music. It was about the courage to redefine yourself in an industry that wanted you frozen in time. Ricky may have lost some fans along the way, but in Frankie's eyes, he gained something far more important: integrity. Behind Ricky Nelson's cool smile and soft voice was a man carrying burdens the world never fully saw. Stardom had given him everything: fame, wealth, adoration, but it had also taken just as much away. His marriage to Kristen Harmon, the sister of actor Mark Harmon, was once celebrated as a storybook union. Two beautiful young people building a family under the Hollywood sun. But in reality, their relationship was strained almost from the beginning. The constant pressures of touring, financial mismanagement, and Ricky's restless pursuit of his musical dreams clashed with the demands of raising a family. Arguments turned into battles, and battles into an eventual collapse. By the time the marriage ended, it was bitter, leaving scars not just on Ricky, but on his children as well. Frankie Avalon, looking back now, recalls private moments where Ricky confided in him, moments when the weight of his personal life felt heavier than even the struggles of his career. Ricky spoke about feeling like he was failing at being a husband, a father, and an artist all at once, as if no matter what he did, it was never enough. Frankie, who had managed to keep a relatively stable home life, sympathized but also worried that Ricky was burning himself out from within. Financial troubles only deepened Ricky's pain. Despite years of success, poor investments, legal disputes, and the relentless expenses of maintaining his lifestyle drained much of his wealth. Ricky wasn't reckless, but he wasn't business-minded either, and in an industry filled with sharks that left him vulnerable. Frankie recalls Ricky joking about how money seemed to vanish faster than he could earn it. But beneath the humor was real fear. There were also battles with self-doubt that haunted Ricky. He wanted respect as a serious musician, yet critics often dismissed him as a relic of the past, a former teen idol who refused to accept his decline. Frankie admits that Ricky often struggled to reconcile who he was with who the world thought he should be. It was a conflict that ate at him, robbing him of peace. Avalon, even now, describes Ricky as one of the most misunderstood men he ever knew. Gentle, caring, talented, yet unable to escape the shadows cast by fame and expectation. The fans saw perfection, but his friends saw the cracks beneath the surface. To Frankie, Ricky Nelson was a man trying desperately to balance two lives: the public icon who could never falter, and the private soul who longed for understanding, forgiveness, and freedom. On December 31st, 1985, the world of music was shaken by news that seemed impossible to believe. Ricky Nelson, the boy who had grown up before America's eyes, the man who had reinvented himself against the odds, was gone at just 45 years old. His private plane, en route to Dallas for a New Year's Eve concert, had crashed in DeKalb, Texas, killing Ricky, his fiancée, and several members of his band. For millions of fans, the headlines were like a cruel joke. How could someone so young, so vibrant, be taken so suddenly? But for Frankie Avalon, it wasn't just a headline. It was the devastating loss of a friend. Frankie remembers exactly where he was when he heard the news, the disbelief that washed over him, the silence that followed. He had known Ricky for decades, shared conversations that few others ever heard, and now all of it was gone in an instant. At the time, rumors swirled, stories of drugs, of recklessness, but the official investigation determined the fire on board had likely been caused by a faulty heater. Frankie has always believed those rumors were unfair, a cruel distortion of Ricky's memory. He wasn't reckless. He wasn't out of control. He was a man doing what he loved, performing, giving his music to the fans who still cherished him. Ricky's death struck Avalon like a warning bell. At the time, Frankie was still active in the business, still touring, still carrying the weight of his own career. But Ricky's passing forced him to confront the fragility of life in the spotlight. It reminded him that fame offers no protection from tragedy, that no amount of talent or charm could shield someone from fate. The aftermath was heartbreaking. Fans lined up at memorials. The Nelson family grieved in public silence, and tributes poured in from across the music world. To Frankie, it felt as though an era had ended. A chapter of American music had closed forever. Ricky Nelson wasn't just another singer. He had been a pioneer, a bridge between the innocence of the 1950s and the authenticity of the decades that followed. For Frankie Avalon, losing Ricky was more than losing a peer. It was losing a mirror, a man who had walked a similar path, who understood the burden of fame, who shared the struggles no one else could see. Decades later, Frankie still feels the sting of that day. He admits that not a year goes by without him thinking of Ricky, of what might have been had he lived longer, of the music he might have created, and the peace he might have finally found. At 84 years old, Frankie Avalon looks back on a life few could imagine. He has known the thrill of fame, the roar of fans, the flashing lights of Hollywood, and the quiet satisfaction of surviving long after the spotlight dimmed. But when asked about Ricky Nelson, his voice softens, his tone shifts, and you can hear the weight of memory pressing down. To Frankie, Ricky wasn't just another teen idol. He was a brother in arms, a friend who understood the strange, lonely burden of being adored by millions, yet known by so few. Avalon admits that through the years, he rarely spoke publicly about Ricky, not because he didn't care, but because some stories felt too private, too sacred to be shared with the world. Now, at this stage of his life, he feels it is time. He recalls the late-night talks backstage, when the noise of screaming fans had faded, and Ricky would lean back, guitar in hand, and talk about music, life, and the search for something real. Frankie says those were the moments when Ricky revealed his truest self. Not the boy next door, not the heartthrob, not even the pioneering country rock star, but simply a man searching for peace. Avalon admits there was a quiet sadness in Ricky, even during his happiest times, a restlessness that never left him. He wanted respect, he wanted love, he wanted freedom. But the chains of fame were hard to break. Frankie confesses that Ricky's struggles made him think about his own life, about the choices he made to protect his family, to diversify into film, to avoid the darker traps of the industry. Yet even with his own stability, Avalon often wondered, did Ricky, in chasing artistic truth, pay a price that was too high? Still, Frankie insists that Ricky Nelson's legacy is far greater than the headlines, greater than the tragedy of his untimely death. In his eyes, Ricky was not just a teen idol frozen in the 1950s. He was an innovator, a musician who dared to blend sounds before others thought it possible, a man who laid the groundwork for genres that would shape decades of American music. Frankie reflects that Ricky's garden party said it best. You can't please everyone, so you've got to please yourself. And in those words, Ricky gave voice to an entire generation of artists struggling to break free from expectations. To Avalon, Ricky's courage to pursue authenticity, even at the cost of popularity, makes him one of the most important figures of their era. As Frankie speaks now, his eyes often grow misty because he knows how fragile life is, how quickly it can vanish. He survived, Ricky did not, and in that contrast lies both gratitude and sorrow. Avalon says he still hears Ricky's voice sometimes when he listens to old records, still sees him smiling under the hot lights of a stage, still remembers the shy young man who just wanted to be understood. He should have been here with us, Frankie admits quietly. He had so much more to give. In the end, Frankie Avalon's story is not just about his own success or survival. It is about friendship, about memory, about carrying the legacy of those who left too soon. And when he finally opens up about Ricky Nelson, it is not to share scandal or sensational secrets, but to remind the world that behind the idol was a human being, fragile, brilliant, and unforgettable. For Frankie, the boy who sang Travelin' Man will always remain more than just a fellow star. He will remain a reminder of what it means to chase dreams, face demons, and leave behind a legacy that endures long after the music fades.